But what has kept the African American community down? And here's the answer, and here's the big truth that Juneteenth and everything is intended to hide. The one thing that has kept the African American community down, while other communities have moved in the inner city and moved out, is the Democratic Party. That's it. So here's Joe Biden, and Joe Biden is announcing the Juneteenth holiday, and he goes that it is the essential feature of a great country that we face up to our worst sins, the worst things we've done. And I agree with that, but the first question I want to ask is, what do you mean by the word we? Who's we, right? Well, America, Dinesh, as you know, did this and America did that. No. America didn't do it. The Democratic Party did it. They did it, and we tried to stop them. Now, if this seems like I'm giving some kind of an ideological spin on history, you know, Dinesh, you're sort of cherry-picking the data, nonsense. In 1860, which was the year before the Civil War, there were 4 million slaves in America. 4 million. The number of those slaves owned by Republicans, by the way, a number that is only greater than 0 because there were a handful of Republicans in the border states. These were Democrats who became Republicans at the last minute because they didn't want secession. They supported slavery, but they didn't support secession. So these were like late-term Republicans. But the number of Republicans that owned slaves in 1860 of the 4 million is, to the best count of American historians, and I've had a big debate about this with like 150 left-wing historians, the number that they've been able to come up with is approximately 10. 10. Now, there were a couple of other minor parties, but what this means is that of all the remaining 3,999,000 slaves, the vast majority were owned by Democrats, and that is a fact. That's a fact. And then the Democrats opposed the 13th Amendment. Think about it. After the Civil War, they opposed the amendment to free the slaves. And this is the Northern and the Southern. In fact, it's only the Northern Democrats. People think, well, it's the Southern Democrats. No, because the Southern states were not yet back in the Union. Only the Northern Democrats were voting. And they overwhelmingly opposed the 13th Amendment to free the slaves, the 14th Amendment to give equal rights under the law, and the 15th Amendment to give blacks the right to vote. So when Joe Biden says, let's face up to our history, I'm thinking, you unbelievable, and see with Biden, I never know. I'm about to say, you unbelievable dunce, you complete fool, you nincompoop. But I think with Biden, you have this remarkable phenomenon in which his administration combines the nincompoopery of the Carter years with the malevolence of the Obama years. So I never know if you're dealing with stupid or if you're dealing with evil, and I've come to the conclusion that you're dealing with both. But my point is, if you want to have a modicum of introspection, accountability, moral honesty, why don't you do something that has never happened in American history? Why don't you, as the leading Democrat in the country, take responsibility for your history? Why don't you say that the worst crimes in America, we, the Democrats, did? We owned the slaves. We supported slavery. We tried to block the civil rights movement. We had these so-called Negro barbecues. We had the lynchings. We had the racial terrorism. Every segregation law was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials. There's no exception to this rule. So this is the history, your history. Why don't you admit it? Why don't you apologize for it? Why don't you tell the black community that if reparations are due, send the bill to the DNC? They won't do it. All these progressives on TV, they'll talk about Juneteenth, oh, it's wonderful. Not one word about the complicity of the Democratic Party. And you know why? Because if they did it, they'd have to explain why they're in that party. They'd have to explain why they, as progressives, champions of racial justice, Black Lives Matter. And by the way, we're not just talking about ancient history. Look at all the problems in our inner cities right now. Problems that obviously fall heaviest on minority communities. Who's doing that? Who runs those cities? Why don't they take responsibility for what they're doing now? Even if they won't take responsibility for history, well, those were our ancestors, Dinesh. Well, my favorite, Dinesh, I don't know if you know, but read Wikipedia, the parties switch sides. So the idea here, think of how nuts this is, that the responsibility of the Democratic Party is somehow transferred to the Republican Party because according to them, the parties switch sides. Now, let's leave aside whether the parties switch sides. They didn't, but let's say they did. It's kind of like saying, well, you know what? My neighbor is an axe murderer. He killed all these people. He lives in the house next door. I live next door to him. Let's say we switch houses. I move into his house. He moves into my house. Does that mean that his crimes automatically transfer to me? No, he still did them. It doesn't matter if the parties switch sides later. The person who carried out those atrocities has to take responsibility for them.